welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 31. Collapse. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed the beginning of the era of Seljuk history known as Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya, the state of the Nizam. The rule of the Great Seljuk Empire by the partnership of Melik Shah and the Grand Vizier Nizam ul-Mulk, with Nizam ul-Mulk very much the senior partner. We ended with the Nawakiya Beylik of Syria and the Turkish conquest of the Levant, the failed invasion of Egypt, and the final victory of the court over the tribes everywhere except for Anatolia, that is. And today, we will not only finish the story of Nizam ul-Mulk and Melik Shah, but we will leave the story of the Great Seljuks. Because the end of Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya would turn out to also be the end of the golden age of the Great Seljuk Empire. And it would be followed by the splintering of the state, with its most famous component surviving in Anatolia as the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. So picking up with the story, by the late 1070s, things were looking pretty good for the court in Esfahan. The supremacy of the Seljuk court across Khorasan, Iran, Iraq, the Caucasus, and even Syria, the Levant, and Transoxiana was unquestioned. In 1079, Melik Shah even made a show of force in Kirman, where Kavort's son Sultan Shah ibn Kavort was ruling. The Seljuk Sultan strode out from Esfahan, coming to southeastern Iran to demonstrate his authority through a royal visit. According to Ibn al-Athir, when Sultan Shah heard that Melik Shah was en route, he went out to meet him on the road by which the Sultan was coming, taking many gifts and did obeisance in an exaggerated form. The Sultan confirmed him in his lands and showed him kindness. Now, of course, there were still inevitable revolts, but they were pretty easy to put down. In 1081, Melik Shah's brother Tekesh revolted in Khorasan. According to Ibn al-Athir, the proximate cause was Melik Shah cashiering 7,000 soldiers from the army against the advice of Nizam ul-Mulk. These disgruntled 7,000 soldiers then traveled east from Rey to Khorasan. There they joined up with Tekesh, who now felt confident enough to raise the flag of revolt. He quickly took Nishapur. But Melik Shah was able to raise an even greater army and march on Nishapur. Realizing that he had no hope of holding the city, Tekesh retreated to Termiz, just to the north of the Amudarya, where he sued for peace. Tekesh would revolt again in 1085, and as with prior revolts of the princes of the House of Seljuk, it appears that he drew on the wild tribes. Ibn al-Athir makes an oblique reference that his men preferred disorder, likely a reference to the wilder Turkmen that Tekesh relied upon. But as before, this revolt was again put down. Tekesh got as far as Serach, one of the very first cities that had fallen to the Seljuks back during the birth of the empire, before he was again defeated. This time, Melik Shah appears to have ordered that he be blinded and imprisoned. But aside from this relatively minor revolt of Tekesh, the regime seemed to be on pretty solid footing. Melik Shah even launched campaigns to expand the borders of the Great Seljuk Empire further than ever before. As Tutush expanded his power west in Syria, as we discussed last time, Melik Shah traveled east again, crossing the Amudarya to assert Seljuk power in Transoxiana. If you'll recall from last episode, in the early years of his reign, Melik Shah had concluded the war his father Alparslan had started by defeating the Karakhanids and taking Samarkand. The House of Afrasiab had then been forced to bend the knee and become a vassal of the Great Seljuk Empire. This lasted until the succession of Ahmad Khan, sometime in the mid-1080s. Ahmad Khan rebelled against Seljuk overlordship, and Melik Shah was forced to cross the river to deal with him, and he was successful in this. So by the 1080s, it would appear that the state had never been stronger, and it continued to cook, as the Chinese would say, to become more sedentary, less nomadic, as the power of Nizam ul-Mulk and his emirs and bureaucrats became entrenched, and the power of the tribes weakened. Now all of that has to come with the huge caveat that we're only speaking about outside of Anatolia, where the new Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had just been established. And in many ways, this was the golden age of the Great Seljuks, the zenith of the empire's power and prosperity. There is indeed a reason why basically all later Islamic histories point to Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya as a pinnacle, as a high watermark to be ruefully remembered in the coming era of civil war, disorder, and defeat at the hands of the Crusaders. But under the surface, tensions were simmering that would break apart the Great Seljuk Empire and tear down this golden age. First, there appear to have been rising tensions between the Sultan and the caliphs. There are references to Melik Shah increasingly visiting Baghdad and staying for longer and longer. He even began using the city of the caliphs as a winter capital of a sort, much to the consternation of the caliph al-Muqtadi, the son of al-Qayyim. As I said in an earlier episode, the relationship between the Seljuk and Abbasid dynasties was always somewhat tense. Both sides needed each other, but feared each other. The sultans relied on the caliphs to legitimize the regime, especially given their steppe barbarian origins. And in turn, the Abbasids relied on the sultans to uphold Sunni orthodoxy and defeat the Shia heretics. But always, the sultans feared that the caliphs would intervene in Seljuk politics, prop up a claimant to the throne, and the caliphs always wondered if the sultans would finish them off and claim the caliphate for themselves. And as Melik Shah moved into Baghdad more permanently as his reign progressed, the caliph al-Muqtadi responded by enforcing within the city his traditional rights, the right to implement the Sharia. In 1086, he ordered the wine in the city's markets to be ostentatiously poured out. He also imposed sumptuary laws on non-Muslims. And in 1088, the caliph even expelled the Turks from the harem of his Turkish wife, a princess of the House of Seljuk. Ibn al-Athir reports, the caliph ordered the expulsion of the Turks, and they were moved out, every last one of them, within 1 hour and in a most wretched state, when it was time for late evening prayers. And Nizam ul-Mulk and Melik Shah were of course deeply unhappy with all of this, and increasingly pondering what to do with the Abbasid dynasty. Then, as we have discussed at length, as always, there was tension between the tribes and the court. But as the court, the institutions of the central state, had become increasingly powerful during Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya, the wild tribes had been increasingly pushed out of Iran and the central lands of the empire. Mostly, they rushed into Anatolia, where the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was being established as a vassal state of a sort. The traditional date given for the establishment of the Sultanate in Anatolia, by the way, is 1081, which is a little bit of a simplification as we will discuss in a later episode. But by no means did all of the tribes leave, and across the empire, there was still the continuing tension between the settled peoples and the nomads grazing their herds across the lands. And this tension between the tribes and the court flows into the other great division, the division between the central state and the vassals on the periphery. Now, the most important of these vassals was, of course, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Descended from the Nawakiya tribal confederation and full of wild Turkmen, this new sultanate will of course become the subject of our story, and it was often at odds with the court in Esfahan. In 1081, Suleiman, the son of Kutalmish, had taken Nicaea, and according to tradition, it was in this year that he declared himself to be a sultan, though a sultan subject to his cousin, the Great Seljuk Melik Shah. But though Suleiman nominally professed loyalty to Melik Shah, he was constantly trying to consolidate his control over the Nawakiya remaining in the central lands of the empire, even invading into Syria and northern Iraq. And as we discussed last time, he had earlier tangled with Atsuz and attempted to consolidate power over Syria and the Levant. And there were yet other troublesome vassals. As we have discussed earlier in the episode, the Karakhanate Khanate in Central Asia had become a vassal of the Great Seljuk Empire, stretching nominal Seljuk authority to the very borders of China. But the House of Afrasiab remained in charge in these lands and could always rise up against the court in Esfahan. And in Kirman, in southeastern Iran, and in the Outremer territory of Oman, the descendants of Kavort continued to rule. And of course, the line of Kavort could not be trusted entirely. Finally, in the Caucasus, northern Syria, northern Iraq, and southern Turkey, the old borderlands with the Byzantine state prior to Manzikert, there remained the emirs of places like Aleppo, Ganja, Derbend, Mosul, and Diyarbakir. Seljuk vassals, but again, not entirely reliable vassals. And all of this ties into perhaps the most critical tension of all, still simmering under the surface: the growing power of the emirs within the lands of the empire. Remember that in order to cut down the power of the Turkish aristocracy and the tribes, that is, the princes of the House of Seljuk and the wild Turkmen they often turned to, Nizam ul-Mulk had dramatically expanded the number and the power of the emirs. These emirs might be the pre-existing Arab, Kurdish, and Persian elites, or they might be Turkish commanders. Whatever their ethnicity, their power and wealth came from the recognition by the Seljuk court and the granting and confirmation of the Iktah. Building off the Perso-Islamic models that stretched all the way back to the anarchy at Samarra, the wily Grand Vizier had granted Iktah fiefs to powerful commanders and nobles. These emirs then became in essence feudal lords of the empire, running their little fiefs. And because their Iktah fiefs could be withdrawn at any time, naturally, they were incentivized to strip them bare and extract maximum value in the present. This led to mismanagement and a looming financial and indeed ecological crisis as Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya progressed. The formerly profitable Iktah fiefs were no longer producing sufficient revenue or even food, and we see increasing references to famine in the sources. Over a period of 20 or so years of mismanagement, by the late 1080s, the Seljuk state was staring down a massive fiscal and indeed ecological crisis. And furthermore, while these emirs were a bulwark of the central state against the wild Turkmen tribes, they increasingly became powers in their own rights, a story that we have seen before on this podcast, of course. In Syria, for example, as Tutush destroyed the Nawakiya Beylik, he did not remain a mere servant of the court. He became a powerful emir, running what amounted to a mini-state of his own, though he was careful to never cross his brother Melik Shah too openly. Another of the main emirs to arise in the west was Artuk, the progenitor of what would come to be the Artukid Beylik. Incidentally, if you have the chance, you should really make the time to visit the city of Mardin in southeastern Turkey, which would come to be the last capital of the Artukid Beylik. It is an absolutely gorgeous city, built on a mountain and full of Seljuk and Artukid architecture of a type that you really can't see anywhere else. Artuk started out as a leader of the Turkmen, who led a devastating raid of the city of Basra in 1086. But despite this attack on the rich lands of southern Iraq, Melik Shah decided that he should be set up in what is now northern Iraq, in Syria, and southern Turkey, an area called the Jazirat. Here, he could act as a bulwark against the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum and bring into line the local Arab and Kurdish emirs. There, in the Jazirat, he and his descendants would come to carve out their own beylik in time. So as they grew richer, as more power was vested in them, as the tribes decamped to Anatolia, and even as they stripped their Iktah fiefs bare, these emirs were slowly turning from servants of the court to masters of the state. And it would be these new powerful emirs who would ultimately destroy the Great Seljuk Empire. So the picture we should have in our minds of the Great Seljuk Empire at this time, the late 1070s and the 1080s, is of an increasingly centralized court ruling over an increasingly fractious empire, which itself teetered on the edge of an economic and fiscal crisis. On the peripheries, the very success of the Seljuk conquests had created unreliable vassals, and at least in Anatolia and Kirman, these vassals were full of the wild Oghuz tribes with whom the court had always been in tension. And in the lands of the center itself, particularly the western half of the empire, a new breed of powerful emir had arisen, one perhaps capable of even overthrowing the state. Now Melik Shah and Nizam ul-Mulk were of course acutely aware of this, and the political situation in the westernmost parts of the empire in particular was deeply concerning to them. The rise of Suleiman and the Sultanate of Rum, the growing power of Tutush and Artuk, caused great consternation in Esfahan. In 1084, as we will cover in more detail in later episodes, Suleiman was able to take the great city of Antioch from the Byzantines. Antioch lay just to the south and the west of Aleppo, near the Mediterranean. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was therefore moving closer to Tutush and the great Seljuk lands of Syria and the Levant recently taken from the Nawakiya. Melik Shah of course congratulated Suleiman for his victory over the infidels, but through gritted teeth, and he insisted that these lands, like all of the lands of the Sultanate of Rum, were ultimately under his sovereignty. And needless to say, Suleiman's conquest of Antioch ended up resulting in a quarrel between him and the Emir of Aleppo, as the two rival vassals of Melik Shah began raiding each other's territory. This ultimately led to a great battle in which the Emir of Aleppo fell. So though outwardly professing loyalty to Melik Shah, the Seljuk Sultan of Rum was very much running his own game, and he began to increasingly encroach into the territories of the Great Seljuk Empire itself. In attempting to consolidate control of the Turkmen in the west of the empire, Suleiman was in essence trying to supplant Melik Shah, who, remember, had always had very poor relations with the tribes. And so Melik Shah gathered up his forces to confront his obnoxious vassal Suleiman. Melik Shah began marching west, just as Suleiman marched on Aleppo itself. Meanwhile, the head man of Aleppo, the man actually running the city now that the emir had been finished off by Suleiman, sent urgent messages to Tutush in Damascus. Tutush, who had by now seen off Fatimid attempts to retake the Levant and had consolidated his power over the whole region, quickly responded. He began assembling an army to deal with this upstart new sultan, and summoned to him Artuk, now newly ensconced in the Jazirat. The combined armies of Tutush and Artuk met Suleiman's forces outside of Aleppo in June 1086. As we will discuss in much more detail in a later episode, Suleiman's forces were defeated and the Sultan of Rum was killed. Aleppo was now, finally, firmly in the hands of the Great Seljuk Empire, albeit actually in the hands of two powerful emirs, not directly in the hands of Melik Shah himself. Melik Shah finally reached Aleppo in October 1086. As the Sultan approached, it appears that Artuk tried to convince Tutush to attack his brother Melik Shah. In a real sign of the strength of the emirs, the tension simmering under the surface of the Seljuk state, Artuk reportedly said to Tutush, "They have just arrived, and they and their horses are so tired that they would be unable to resist. If they did, we would be victorious." But Tutush responded, "I will not break the reputation of my brother, under whose protection I shelter. it would first of all weaken me. Unable to convince Tutush to betray his brother, Artuk gave up on the plan to attack the Sultan. Tutush left Aleppo, heading back to Damascus as Artuk slunk back to the Jazirat. Melik Shah finally entered into Aleppo, bringing the city finally directly under the rule of the Seljuk Sultan. But this wasn't Melik Shah's only campaign to the borders of the empire. 3 years later, in 1089, Melik Shah and Nizam ul-Mulk assembled a great army, which the Sultan led across the Amudarya. Melik Shah was forced to cross the river because, seeing the Sultan mired in the west, Ahmad Khan had decided to try to win independence for the Karakhanids. Ibn al-Athir tells us, when the Sultan left Esfahan for Khorasan, he assembled his forces from all of his lands and crossed the river with an army that no clerks could count, nor anyone could number. The Sultan then made for Bukhara, quickly taking it, and then moved on to Samarkand, which he put under siege. The Seljuk army quickly erected siege works and began battering the walls with catapults. Ibn al-Athir tells us, when the Sultan's troops scaled the wall, Ahmad Khan fled and hid in the houses of some of the common people. His whereabouts were revealed, and he was seized and carried to the Sultan with a rope around his neck. The Sultan greeted him with honor, freed him, and sent him to Esfahan with people to guard him. A more compliant Karakhanid ruler was then installed in Samarkand. With the western half of the Karakhanid Khanate now again a vassal, Melik Shah then marched even further east, to Kashgar, the capital of the eastern half of the Karakhanid Khanate, which had never submitted to the Seljuks. There, Melik Shah demanded that the Eastern Khan read the khutbah in his name, strike coins in his name, and pay tribute. Unable to resist, the Eastern Khan submitted. Seljuk power had never stretched further. Melik Shah then began moving back to Khorasan, but was delayed by a revolt in Samarkand. The Sultan was forced to retake the city, but the leader of the rebellion thereupon fled to Kashgar, whose ruler happened to be his brother. Melik Shah was therefore forced to order his brand new vassal in Kashgar to deliver his rebellious brother to him. According to Ibn al-Athir, he threatened the lord of Kashgar that, if he did not deliver him, his lands would be invaded and he would become the Sultan's enemy. Reluctantly, the Eastern Khan ordered that his brother be blinded and delivered to Melik Shah. As he rode back to Iran, the power of the House of Seljuk had been expanded further east than ever before. The Great Empire now stretched from the borders of the Roman Empire to the borders of China, from the mountains of the Caucasus to the deserts of Oman, from the steppes of Central Asia to the borders of India, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the deserts of Central Asia. Yet the end of this united Great Seljuk Empire was not far off. As we have discussed, under the surface, great tensions were threatening to tear the empire apart. Tensions between the Sultan and the Caliph, the Sultan and his vassals, between the court and the tribes, and above all, among the Emirs and between the Emirs and the center. Though the regime appeared on the surface to be all-powerful, Melik Shah and Nizam ul-Mulk were actually juggling between their hands a very delicate piece of porcelain, one with the cracks already showing. And all that it would take to break it would be for the duo holding it to slip. And this is, of course, precisely what happened. After decades of ruling together, with the Sultan as the junior partner, the partnership between Nizam ul-Mulk and Melik Shah broke down. This unequal partnership had always been the key to the regime's stability, and its end unleashed all of the pent-up energy roiling under the surface. Or if you prefer the porcelain analogy, when the juggling duo ceased cooperating, it was inevitable that the delicate porcelain would fall and break. And so it was that when Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya fell apart, the tensions within the state that this partnership ruled tore apart the empire. Essentially, it seems that as Melik Shah aged, he became more and more frustrated at serving as the junior partner in power to his wily Grand Vizier. He chafed at the rule of his mentor, the Al-Nizamiyya in Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya. We start seeing indications of this in the sources in the late 1070s and early 1080s. That is, when Melik Shah was entering his 30s. No longer a youthful son, but a man. A sultan who didn't really rule his own empire. Ibn al-Athir, for example, relates an illuminating incident surrounding a Jewish tax farmer in Basra. He says that in 1080, Melik Shah went to Khuzestan and, with him, was Tekin and Goharin. They were both working to secure the death of Ibn Alan the Jew, the tax farmer of Basra, who was under the protection of Nizam ul-Mulk. Tekin al-Sharabi and Goharin were enemies of Nizam ul-Mulk, and that was the reason they were hostile to the Jew. Melik Shah ordered him drowned, and this was done. So the Sultan intervened to aid other courtiers to destroy an ally of Nizam ul-Mulk. And interestingly, the title borne by Tekin, al-Sharabi, means the cupbearer or the wine bearer. This would be a position of great personal closeness to the Sultan, the man waiting on him at table. In fact, maybe even his drinking buddy. The fact that this man was an enemy of Nizam ul-Mulk is an indication of the feelings towards the Grand Vizier among the personal coterie surrounding the Sultan, and perhaps of the Sultan himself. And it wasn't just Melik Shah's cupbearer who hated Nizam ul-Mulk. Melik Shah's wife, Terken Khatun, the daughter of the Western Khan of the Karakhanids, was also a bitter enemy of the Grand Vizier. Terken Khatun was an exceptionally intelligent and cunning woman, and incredibly powerful. And as a Karakhanid princess, a daughter of the ancient and venerable House of Afrasiab, she wasn't merely a power behind the throne, but increasingly a power in her own right. And she is going to become incredibly important to our story. Sibt ibn al-Jawzi claims that she commanded at least 10,000 troops on her own, mostly Turkish Mamelukes. We can tell just how much Nizam ul-Mulk detested her from his vitriolic screeds against the influence of women at court. And of course, when she had her son Mahmud, Terken Khatun would eventually become insistent that her child succeed Melik Shah. Something that Nizam ul-Mulk was of course dead set against, as he had supported Melik Shah's eldest son, Berkyaruk, as heir. To oppose Nizam ul-Mulk, Terken Khatun supported another vizier, Nizam ul-Mulk's hated rival, Taj ul-Mulk. And as tensions grew between Melik Shah and Nizam ul-Mulk over the 1080s, Terken Khatun was able to secure Taj ul-Mulk's promotion in 1087, the same year as her son Mahmud's birth. Things came to a head between the two men on October 14th, 1092. While traveling along the road from Esfahan to Baghdad with Melik Shah, the elderly Nizam ul-Mulk was stopped by a young man from northern Iran who claimed to be a petitioner. But as the young man approached the elderly Grand Vizier, he suddenly pulled out a dagger, and as Ibn al-Athir relates, he struck him with a dagger he had with him and fled, leaving him dead. He stumbled over a tent guy rope, which allowed men to catch up with him and kill him. See, the petitioner was in fact one of the assassins, a revolutionary Ismaili Shia sect that adopted murder as a tactic to advance their political and religious agenda. Like the coming 19th century anarchists or modern-day Islamists, the assassins had an essentially utopian religio-political project and came to believe that violence against the figures of established power was the way to achieve it. The propaganda of the deed, as the anarchists will eventually say. Now, I promise, we're going to dive into the assassins in a non-narrative episode on religion in the Great Seljuk Empire. But it's important to note for now that this order of violent Shia mystics had emerged under the Seljuk Empire. Its founder had been born in 1050, and Nizam ul-Mulk was one of the first, if not the first, of their victims. But while it is true that Nizam ul-Mulk was exactly the type of person that Ismaili assassins would want to get rid of for their own reasons, there is a lot of evidence that Melik Shah had authorized or even instigated this murder. Our sources are not exactly open about this because most authors are both very pro-Nizam ul-Mulk and very pro-Melik Shah. If you're writing during the period to come and looking back on Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya as a golden age, you're going to want to paint both the Sultan and the Grand Vizier in a good light. But of course, this makes it really hard to tell the story of their falling out. Even Ibn al-Athir, who is probably the most pro-Nizam ul-Mulk and pro-Melik Shah author out there, relates that the proximate cause of the death of Nizam ul-Mulk was a spat between the vizier and the sultan over the arrest and punishment of a man who had fallen afoul of the Grand Vizier. He writes that Melik Shah sent Nizam ul-Mulk a letter by Taj ul-Mulk saying, "If you are my partner in power, your hand with mine holds the sultanate. That is a legitimate action. But if you are my deputy and under my authority, then you ought to keep to the limits of a deputy." Ibn al-Athir then goes out of his way to concoct a reconciliation between the two men, but says that a conspiracy nevertheless formed at court without Melik Shah's knowledge that resulted in Nizam ul-Mulk's murder being arranged. And though we cannot be certain, I think that given the hints scattered throughout our sources, and what we know about the rising tension between the Sultan and the Grand Vizier, it is extremely probable that Melik Shah and potentially his wife Terken Khatun arranged and directed the death of Nizam ul-Mulk. And so, Nizam ul-Mulk was assassinated. With him passed Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya, the state of the Nizam. Nizam ul-Mulk had done more than probably anyone since Tughral to really build a Seljuk state, an empire in the established Perso-Islamic tradition. Under his watch, the state was truly transformed, and it became a state of unrivaled power, wealth, and prosperity. In some sense, if you're looking at this from a Persian perspective and not a Turkish perspective, you can say that Nizam ul-Mulk harnessed steppe power, tamed it, and used it to establish a Persian state greater and grander than any since the days of the Achaemenid Persian Empire of Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes. The power of Iran stretched from the Mediterranean to the borders of China for the first time in thousands of years. But at the same time, Nizam ul-Mulk's successes, his reforms, ultimately sowed the seeds of his destruction and the destruction of the state that he had done so much to build. As we have seen so many times on this podcast already, he brought his own undertakers into being, both in the literal sense that the man who he had groomed to be sultan had killed him, and in the metaphorical sense that the emirs that he had created and empowered would shortly rip apart the state that he had devoted his life to. The assassination of Nizam ul-Mulk, the end of Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya, ultimately kicked off a series of events that would essentially destroy the Great Seljuk Empire. All of the great tensions roiling under the surface burst forward, like a dam finally breaking, or a cracked window finally shattering. The first real casualty of the disorder that would soon erupt across the empire as the collapse began was Melik Shah himself. Indeed, the Sultan would not outlive his Grand Vizier by more than a couple of weeks. After the assassination of Nizam ul-Mulk, Melik Shah went on to Baghdad, now the sole ruler of the Great Seljuk Empire. As we have discussed in this episode, there was by now a great deal of tension between the Sultan and the Caliph al-Muqtadi, which has of course been getting worse over 1091 and 1092. In 1091, Melik Shah and Nizam ul-Mulk had demanded that the vaguely anti-Seljuk Grand Vizier of the Caliph be sacked for criticizing the Sultan. Reportedly, the vizier even mocked Melik Shah's conquests in Transoxiana, saying, "This is nothing to send victory communiques about, as though he had conquered the Byzantine lands. Is not all he has done to march against true-believing Muslims, allowing them to be subjected to treatment that is unacceptable for polytheists?" Al-Muqtadi quite reluctantly dismissed his capable Grand Vizier. Then Melik Shah began constructing a massive mosque in Baghdad, the Mosque of the Sultan, and Nizam ul-Mulk, Taj ul-Mulk, and other courtiers began building their own palaces. Melik Shah appeared to be making Baghdad the capital of the empire, or at least the winter capital. And as a side note, I think this really shows how cooked the Seljuk court had become. If you'll recall, Tughral was unable to stay in Baghdad for extended periods of time because the tribes simply would not tolerate it. Indeed, it had led to civil war in the early years of the empire. But the support and the power of the tribes was not what it used to be. The state did not rely on them in the same way that Tughral had, and indeed, they were mostly out of the picture by now. With the tribes now mostly off in Anatolia, the Caucasus, Syria, and northern Iraq, with the state now basically a Persian empire run by a cooked Turk and his vizier, it was totally possible for Melik Shah to make Baghdad his capital. And this, of course, raised huge alarm bells in the palaces of the Caliph. Al-Muqtadi was of course always fearful that Melik Shah would do him in and claim the caliphate for himself. This already tense relationship between the Seljuk and Abbasid dynasties immediately got worse when Melik Shah arrived in Baghdad on October 30th, 1092, carrying with him the news that Nizam ul-Mulk was dead. I think this partially was because Nizam ul-Mulk had been pretty good at managing the relationship between the Seljuk and Abbasid dynasties. But far more importantly, with his powerful Grand Vizier gone, and himself now the supreme ruler of the state, Melik Shah appears to have begun to move against the other great power in the empire, the Caliph himself. And Al-Muqtadi's fear grew immeasurably. If the Sultan can have Nizam ul-Mulk assassinated, as the rumor mill surely said, then he can also have a caliph assassinated. Then, a couple of days after the arrival of the Sultan, in early November 1092, the caliph's worst fears were confirmed. As Sibt ibn al-Jawzi writes, the Sultan sent to the caliph saying, "You must leave Baghdad to me and depart for whatever country you wish." The caliph was extremely alarmed at this and replied, "Give me a month's delay." The reply came, "It is not possible for you to delay even an hour." Baghdad, the city of the caliphs, the very seat of Sunni orthodoxy, would be without an Abbasid caliph for the first time since the Shia commander of the guard, al-Basasiri, had imprisoned al-Qayyim during Tughral's reign. If the Abbasid caliph was to be driven from the great city, what future possibly awaited him? Clearly, the Sultan was planning for a Seljuk empire without him. Maybe the Sultan would install his grandson Jafar, who had Seljuk lineage through his mother, or maybe Melik Shah was even contemplating a future without the Abbasid dynasty itself. Likely due to the shock throughout the city at the decision of Melik Shah, Al-Muqtadi was able to secure a delay of 10 days. But he knew he had to take action now if he, and perhaps even his dynasty, were to survive. And so it was that on November 7th, 1092, as Melik Shah stopped for lunch while hunting in the vicinity of Baghdad, an assassin cleverly and secretly poisoned the food or wine of the Sultan. The assassin had of course been sent by the Caliph, though some sources say that the supporters of Nizam ul-Mulk also had a hand in this. As Melik Shah returned from the hunt, the effects of the poison began to take hold. As Ibn al-Athir relates, death fixed its talons in him, and neither the extent of his realm nor the number of his troops could protect him. Melik Shah was soon feverish and confined to his bed. His health continued to worsen over the coming weeks, and finally, he died on the evening of November 19th, 1092, at the young age of 37. With him died the united Great Seljuk Empire. What can we say about Melik Shah? Given the catastrophe that's about to unfold, his reign is universally looked upon by the Islamic historians as a golden age. And indeed, under his reign, the Seljuk Empire reached the zenith of its power, prosperity, and sophistication. The authority of the Seljuk Sultan, at least nominally, stretched from western Anatolia to the borders of China, from Central Asia to Yemen, from Nicaea to Kashgar. Melik Shah is remembered as being personally devout, modest, and cultured. As we will discuss, he patronized the arts and sciences and oversaw a cultural flowering. But at the same time, as we have already seen, Melik Shah oversaw a state that had become increasingly brittle. The tensions under the surface had continued to grow, indeed helped along by the transformation of the state accomplished under his watch. And on a more immediate level, I would note that it was in fact Melik Shah who had kicked off the collapse of the state. It had been his decision to get rid of Nizam ul-Mulk and then his attempt to get rid of al-Muqtadi that ultimately doomed him, and thus doomed the state. Because with Melik Shah gone, the tensions roiling under the surface that had been held at bay during Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya would soon tear apart the Great Seljuk Empire. The empire would become convulsed in a massive multi-sided and bloody civil war, as the princes of the House of Seljuk fell upon each other like wolves, and the Emirs rose up to take control of the empire. And so we will end today, and indeed end our story of the Great Seljuks, with a discussion of that civil war. Immediately after the death of Melik Shah, his wife Terken Khatun attempted to stabilize the regime and seize power on behalf of her 5-year-old son Mahmud, so in reality power for herself. According to Ibn al-Athir, she was even able to hide the death of her husband to buy herself time as she initially maneuvered for power, but that's not found in all of the sources. Terken Khatun quickly moved to secure the loyalty of the troops in Baghdad. She did this, of course, through massive payments of gold. According to Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, she spent the treasury that Melik Shah had amassed and with it secured the backing of the army. And remember, all of this is happening as an economic crisis unfolds. So emptying the state's coffers to pay the troops, while likely necessary, was of course spending resources that could not be easily replaced. With her allies, the new Grand Vizier Taj ul-Mulk and the commander of the Baghdad garrison, the Emir Onur, Terken Khatun then reached out to the other key stakeholder in Baghdad, to the Caliph al-Muqtadi. They soon came to an agreement whereby the young Mahmud would be proclaimed the Sultan, but as he was only 5 years old, Terken Khatun would serve as his regent, and since she was a woman, the actual day-to-day command of the armies would be in the hands of the Emir Onur. The vizierate would remain with Taj ul-Mulk. The Caliph al-Muqtadi would of course be allowed to stay in Baghdad, and the meddling in the affairs of the Caliph that had begun during the end of Melik Shah's reign would of course cease. With this arrangement agreed to, al-Muqtadi ordered the khutbah to be read in the name of Mahmud throughout the Great Seljuk Empire. Even in the holy sanctuaries of Mecca and Medina, recently wrested from the Fatimids, the name of the 5-year-old sultan was read. But this new regime, led by Terken Khatun, was of course not going to be accepted by everyone. For one thing, her ally, the Grand Vizier Taj ul-Mulk, had been the great enemy of Nizam ul-Mulk, and Nizam ul-Mulk's partisans were still out there, burning with rage against the new Grand Vizier and this Karakhanid princess. These included a group of Turkish slave soldiers called the Nizamiyya, who were Turkish Mamelukes previously commanded by Nizam ul-Mulk, and they could be very, very dangerous. And of course, there were other princes of the House of Seljuk. In Syria and the Levant, Tutush, the brother of Melik Shah, was of course having none of this. In the words of Ibn al-Athir, he assembled his troops, raised money, and moved to Aleppo. Aleppo, the great city that he had conquered before surrendering it to Melik Shah, was soon occupied by Tutush. With his position in Syria now secured, Tutush began planning for how he could take the throne himself. In Anatolia, there was of course the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, now led by the great Kılıç Aslan, who we will get to eventually, of course, I promise you. In Kirman, the line of Kavort still ruled. In Transoxiana, there was the House of Afrasiab. And throughout the empire, there were powerful emirs like Artuk, watching and waiting to see how this was going to play out. But far more importantly, on an immediate level, was another son of Melik Shah, the dead sultan's eldest son, Berkyaruk. Berkyaruk was at this point merely 13 years old. He had been born in 1079 in Esfahan to Melik Shah and his cousin Zubaydah, who was a daughter of Yakut Bey, one of Chahri's other sons. Berkyaruk could therefore boast of a 100% pure Seljuk lineage, and Berkyaruk had always been the candidate favored by Nizam ul-Mulk, who had detested the Karakhanid princess Terken Khatun and her influence at court. He therefore had a very good relationship with those civil servants loyal to Nizam ul-Mulk and Nizam ul-Mulk's own personal Mameluk soldiers, the Nizamiyya. Berkyaruk had been in Esfahan when Nizam ul-Mulk had been assassinated and was still there when news reached the city of the death of Melik Shah and the proclamation of Terken Khatun's son Mahmud as Sultan. Knowing that Berkyaruk was her main rival, Terken Khatun had carefully planned his removal. As soon as she had secured control of Baghdad, Terken Khatun sent off word to Esfahan and ordered the arrest of Berkyaruk. He seems to have been imprisoned and locked up in a jail cell in Esfahan. But then he was able to get word out to the Nizamiyya troops and the old supporters of Nizam ul-Mulk. Furious at Terken Khatun and her regime, in particular, Nizam ul-Mulk's hated rival Taj ul-Mulk, the Nizamiyya slave soldiers sprang into action. According to Ibn al-Athir, the Nizami Mamelukes raided an armory that Nizam ul-Mulk had in Esfahan, took the contents, and raised a riot in the city. They freed Berkyaruk from prison, and making the khutbah in his name in Esfahan, proclaimed him ruler. There were now two sultans. When news of this reached Terken Khatun in Baghdad, she knew that she could not allow this to stand. She could not allow Berkyaruk and the Nizamiyya to defy her. I mean defy her 5-year-old son, the Sultan. And so mustering an army, Terken Khatun began marching towards Esfahan. She brought with her the body of her late husband, determined to lay Melik Shah to rest in the capital of his empire. As Terken Khatun and her army approached Esfahan, Berkyaruk and the Nizamiyya realized that they could not stand against her. The young prince and his supporters abandoned the city, making for Rey in the north. There they linked up with yet more Nizamiyya troops and supporters of the dead Grand Vizier. As Ibn al-Athir relates, the Nizamis were brought to incline towards Berkyaruk by nothing other than their hatred of Taj ul-Mulk, because he was Nizam ul-Mulk's old enemy and suspected of bringing about his death. Though Terken Khatun held Esfahan, Berkyaruk continued to gather support to the north. Terken Khatun attempted to bribe the soldiers to stay loyal, but troops unhappy with Taj ul-Mulk continued to flock to Berkyaruk. Berkyaruk and his army then began marching back south towards Esfahan and managed to take the fortress of Tabarak near the capital. Seeing which way the wind was blowing, several key Iranian emirs then defected from her. Terken Khatun, now feeling a little bit desperate, led her army out of Esfahan to confront Berkyaruk in the field. In January 1093, the battle was finally joined near Barujirt, a large town on the road between Esfahan and Hamadan. Though we don't have exact details of the battle, the sources tell us that Terken Khatun was defeated in the field. She was forced to retreat back to Esfahan, with her army in a severely weakened state. Berkyaruk followed fast on her heels, ultimately besieging Terken Khatun and her army in Esfahan. And then things got worse for Terken Khatun. Her Grand Vizier Taj ul-Mulk, the man hated by the Nizamiyya, and who had in fact gotten her into this mess, quite ignominiously tried to switch sides. Taj ul-Mulk attempted to buy off the Nizamiyya with a gift of 200,000 gold dinars, quite a sum for a state whose treasury was already stretched. He attempted to convince Berkyaruk to make him Grand Vizier. Now, to be fair, Taj ul-Mulk was a man of great talents, and he would have been a very competent Grand Vizier for the now victorious Berkyaruk. But the Nizamiyya and the old supporters of his hated rival Nizam ul-Mulk just were not having it. Ibn al-Athir relates his fate. The Nizamis attacked and killed him, cutting him to pieces. He was slain in Muharram of the year 486, that is February 1093. Now stuck in Esfahan and rapidly losing power, Terken Khatun started looking around for allies. The first thing she did was of course scout around for a new husband, someone with their own armies, a powerful emir. And she landed on Ismail ibn Yaqut, a cousin of Melik Shah and Berkyaruk's maternal uncle. Ismail ruled in Azerbaijan as an emir, but an emir with access to large numbers of Turkmen followers. Terken Khatun convinced Ismail to marry her and bring as a wedding present a massive host of steppe riders. Ismail accepted and arrived in Esfahan in spring 1093. But the defeat of Terken Khatun also opened up space for other claimants. Most importantly, Melik Shah's brother Tutush, who was now well on his way to becoming the number one opponent of Berkyaruk. After taking Aleppo and securing his base of power in Syria, Tutush had marched east to take Nispis, modern-day Nusaybin. There, after hearing news of the defeat of Terken Khatun, he ordered that the khutbah be read in his name throughout Syria. So now there are 3 sultans. From there, Tutush marched towards northern Iraq. In a foreshadowing of what's going to happen throughout the empire, a local powerful Arab emir named Ibrahim had taken control of Mosul. Tutush demanded that Ibrahim read the khutbah in his name and allow him to pass through Mosul to Baghdad, hoping to take the city of the caliphs and be proclaimed in Baghdad as the sultan. But Ibrahim refused, leading to a battle in April 1093, just as Terken Khatun was licking her wounds in Esfahan and trying to figure out what to do. Ibn al-Athir relates, Ibrahim led 30,000 men and Tutush 10,000. On Tutush's right wing was Aksun Kur, and on his left, Buzan. The Arabs charged Buzan and he broke, but Aksun Kur charged the Arabs and put them to flight. The defeat of Ibrahim and the Arabs became complete. Ibrahim himself was taken prisoner, as were several Arab emirs, and they were summarily executed. the road to Baghdad now seemed open to Tutush, and he even seems to have sent messengers off to Baghdad to have the caliph order the khutbah to be read in his name. However, as he was preparing to march on the city of the caliphs to claim the ultimate prize, messengers came to him from Terken Khatun. The wife of the dead sultan was seeking an alliance. Informed of the situation in Iran and the advance of Berkyaruk, Tutush then decided that he had to stop his young nephew. So he agreed to ally with Terken Khatun and assembled his army to ride to Iran and defeat Berkyaruk. And so Tutush gathered up his men and started marching into southern Azerbaijan, on the road to a confrontation with Berkyaruk. But then his top two emirs, Aksunkur, the emir of Aleppo, and Buzan, those same two emirs who had led the charge against Ibrahim, deserted to Berkyaruk. Ibn al-Athir relates that Aksunkur said to Buzan, "We only obeyed this man to see what might be done with the sons of our Lord. Now his son has made a clear move. We want to be with him." And this episode really shows how the power of the emirs was tearing the state apart. Think about it. If you're a powerful emir, who do you want as sultan? Tutush, the 30-something-year-old accomplished charismatic general? A regency of Mahmud under Terken Khatun, the wily, intelligent Karakhanate princess? Or Berkyaruk, a now 14-year-old boy? Obviously Berkyaruk. You can walk all over him. That was why the Nizamiyya were with him. That was why Aksunkur and Buzan deserted. And this desire among powerful emirs for a weak sultan is obviously not going to end well for the great empire. Tutush now realized that he simply did not have the troops required to defeat Berkyaruk, or really the emirs backing Berkyaruk. He also couldn't really take Baghdad. If he took the great city, he would surely be driven out by Berkyaruk's partisans. Instead, he decided that he had to retreat to shore up his position in the west. So he marched back with the remnants of his armies, subjugating Diyarbakir and returning to Syria, determined to build up the forces necessary to win in the end. Meanwhile, the regime around Berkyaruk consolidated power in Iran, Iraq, and the east. Terken Khatun attempted to hold out in Esfahan as the empire fell away from her outside of the capital, but to no avail. She sent her new husband Ismail off in battle against the forces of Berkyaruk, but yet again, powerful emirs among the army decided that a 14-year-old boy was a better choice than a shrewd and capable woman. Ismail was defeated, and then in September 1093, partisans of Berkyaruk, including Aksunkur, got their hands on him and stabbed him to death. By late 1093, the game was up for Terken Khatun. The regime around Berkyaruk was just too strong, with all of the powerful emirs of Iran deciding that they preferred this weak prince to an imposing former queen. With Tutush retrenching in Syria, Iraq soon submitted to Berkyaruk, and in the very last days of 1093, Berkyaruk himself entered Baghdad, and the khutbah was read in his name. Berkyaruk gathered up the forces to confront his uncle, accompanied of course by his powerful emirs. And I'll leave it to you to guess who's actually in power here. A now 14-year-old boy or a clique of powerful and hardened soldiers happy to have someone pliant at the top. The power struggle for the throne was now really between Tutush in the west and Berkyaruk in the east. With Berkyaruk in Iraq, Tutush now began preparing to defeat the young prince. By June 1094, he had defeated his rebellious emir Aksunkur, retaken Aleppo, and had Aksunkur executed. With his control over Syria secured, he began marching towards Iraq. He entered into the vicinity of Diyarbakir just as Berkyaruk's forces began moving up from Baghdad. the two armies fought at Nispis, today's Nusaybin, on the borders of Turkey and Syria. Tutush was able to defeat Berkyaruk, who was forced to retreat back into Iraq, taking Irbil and Mosul. Tutush thereupon decided to outmaneuver Berkyaruk to his rear, to take Iran, the heartland of the empire. He marched into Azerbaijan, sweeping all before him, before finally marching into Hamadan. With Tutush marching into Iran in September 1094, Terken Khatun decided that she had no choice but to ride out to seek refuge with Tutush. Only Tutush had a chance of defeating the regime consolidating around Berkyaruk. Perhaps she even hoped to make him her third husband. But on the road out of Esfahan, she fell seriously ill and was forced to return to the capital. Her health continued to worsen, and she died shortly thereafter. The woman who had ruled the entirety of the Great Seljuk Empire for a couple of months had ended up as nothing more than the mayor of Esfahan. Ibn al-Athir writes that at her death, there remained in her hands nothing but the metropolis of Esfahan, and she had 10,000 Turkish Mamelukes. And though we haven't spent too much time with her, I would like just to note that she was probably the most powerful Turkish woman in history to this point. A woman who commanded armies and ruled an empire. And to have accomplished what she did in such a patriarchal and misogynistic time and place, she must have been a truly gifted and remarkable person. Meanwhile, Berkyaruk had left Iraq to face this attack to his rear. He marched into Esfahan in October 1094, shortly after the death of Terken Khatun. His first action, of course, was to have her infant son Mahmud executed. There was no way he was going to let a claimant live. And thus the sickly child met his end, and Berkyaruk was now the sultan in the capital of Esfahan. But then, Berkyaruk appears to have come down with smallpox, so he was now laid up sick. Hearing the news of Berkyaruk's illness, Tutush decided to strike. If Berkyaruk died of his illness, or even was seriously ill, perhaps he could get the Emirs to switch sides. So Tutush led an army out of Hamadan and began racing south towards Esfahan. His army reached the vicinity of the city in February 1095. Reportedly, Tutush attempted to induce the defections of key emirs supporting the now ailing Berkyaruk, and they responded, "There is nothing between us but the sword." The emirs supporting Berkyaruk were able to raise an army 30,000 strong, as Tutush retreated back to the north. Ibn al-Athir relates, the encounter followed at a place near Rey. Tutush's army was routed, but he stood his ground and was slain. It is said that one of the followers of Aksankur, the lord of Aleppo, killed him in revenge of his master. Berkyaruk, now getting over his smallpox case, was now the sole sultan of the empire. But his regime was in fact extremely weak and brittle. Indeed, who was sitting on the throne was now somewhat besides the point. Everywhere, the state had fallen into chaos. The Islamic histories are crammed full of references to battles and urban disturbances throughout the empire, and they contain such a litany of struggles and deaths among the emirs and princes of the House of Seljuk that I have actually had to pass over most of it so far. There's been so much blood flowing that I can't even really list everything without making the narrative too difficult to follow. And remember that the perverse incentives of the Iqta system have had by now 20 years to work their poison. The state had already been staring down a fiscal crisis, while now that crisis was brought forward by the civil war. As the claimants to the throne stripped the treasuries bare, the exhausted and depleted fiefs of the empire could not replenish them. And more importantly, everywhere, famine and hunger now spread among the common people. And so, the new sultan's regime was now so weak that it could not effectively hold on to power. On some level, it was no longer really a proper state, as had existed during Al-Dawla Al-Nizamiyya. As the state descended into chaos and civil war everywhere, it was the powerful emirs who were actually running the show on the ground. And the young sultan was of course powerless to stop them. Even though he had notionally won the bloody civil war in the immediate term, the state had been so weakened, the emirs grown so powerful, that the empire was in effect not really able to survive, at least in the form that it had existed in prior to the war. And thus it would be that the Great Seljuk Empire would fracture, breaking apart into dozens of successor states and entities. Soon a revolt would arise in the east, resulting in a brother of Melik Shah, Arghun Arslan, carving out his own sultanate in Khorasan. And even when Arghun Arslan was defeated, the man sent by Berkyaruk to do the job, his brother Sanjar, would instead take over the eastern part of the sultanate and go on to rule the east for 6 decades. In Kirman, the line of Kavurt was by now firmly established as an independent sultanate in southeastern Iran and across the Persian Gulf in Oman. In Syria, the line of Tutush remained in power as the sultans of Damascus. In Baghdad and central Iraq, what amounted to an actual caliphal state ruled by the Abbasids had re-emerged. In Transoxiana, the Karakhanids broke away from the control of the House of Seljuk. And throughout the empire, powerful emirs had created what amounted to their own mini-kingdoms. The descendants of Artuk ruled in northern Iraq and southern Turkey, the Shirvan Shahs in the Caucasus, and a host of other emirates I haven't mentioned so far, the Saltukids, the Ildeguzids, the Zangids, the Mazyadids, the Kakuyids. And as we will discuss in more detail in a later episode, in 1097, the Crusaders arrived from the west, taking control of the Holy Land and the Levant from the patchwork of Seljuk vassal emirs. Though it is in fact interesting to note that the Seljuk sources are largely uninterested in the arrival of the Crusaders, instead focusing on the constant crisis and warfare among the emirs. But most important of all for our story, in this environment of war, conflict, hunger, famine, and collapse, no one in the Seljuk center was able, or even all that interested, in meddling in the affairs of Anatolia. And so, in Anatolia, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum would consolidate and emerge as a truly sovereign sultanate. Indeed, the longest lived of any of the Seljuk successor states. And it will be to Anatolia that we will return when we resume the narrative. Thus it was that the golden age of the Great Seljuk Empire came to an end. Though its united rule lasted for less than a century, its legacy would be far longer lived. The successor states would go on to rule for at least another century throughout the Muslim world, in some places until the coming of the Mongols from the east. And the structures of government pioneered by the Great Seljuk Empire would endure even longer, particularly in Anatolia, laying the groundwork for the eventual rise of the Ottomans. Most importantly for our story, it was the Great Seljuk Empire that opened the gates of Anatolia and brought the Turks into their new homeland. But next time, we will take a break from narrative history and we will begin a series of non-narrative episodes about the nature of the Great Seljuk Empire. And we will begin with an episode on the structures of state of the Great Seljuk Empire.